Hi, my name is Ed Smith, and I am one of a team of engineers from the 1970s who worked to design a video game. That video game was called the MP-1000. This is it. As you can see, it's got a joystick that I helped to design, as well as the cartridge slot. And I also helped to design the video output adapter. Most of the peripherals on this game I was responsible for designing. I was also responsible for building out all of the prototypes for these units, for drafting all of these schematic diagrams for these units. So I had a number of different chores that I performed while working at APF. And by the way, one of the other jobs I had to do was to play the games. Because let's face it, after all, somebody had to get to the highest level of the game to make sure there were no bugs. And I was the guy to do that. So I spent 2 hours or so a day just playing games. I don't play games anymore. I'm done with that. But anyway, working at APF is half the story. The other half of the story is where I came from. As you can see, you have an African-American face looking at you telling this story. So there has to be some history there, and there is. So I was born in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York. My parents migrated from Mississippi to New York at a young age. And my mother and my father, they had 7 children, 5 boys, 2 girls. So we all lived in this melting pot of Brownsville. We experienced crime, drugs, prostitution, you name it, at a very young age. I can recall sitting outside while the riots of 1968 were right in front of me, and there was very little that I could do about it as a 14-year-old kid except absorb what I saw happening, and it wasn't good. It wasn't pleasant. So it turned our neighborhood from anything that was at least somewhat livable into a true ghetto. And I had to live through that in a project's life, housing development life. So that's where I started, but that's certainly not where I planned to end up. So I took odd jobs, swept some floors, fixed some appliances, did anything I could to bring in some money. And I knew at a young age that I was pretty good at this stuff, fixing appliances, fixing things. I was fascinated by it. So that fascination became something that I was compelled to do it at one point in my life. And I don't know when this happened, but it did happen. So when it did happen, I said, okay, I'm going to go to high school for technical electronics. And I chose Westinghouse High School and really honed my craft there. The teachers there were great. Mr. Russian, who passed away when I was a senior, was one of the best teachers I ever had. And he really taught me a lot about the nuances of technical electronics. So I took that knowledge from Westinghouse and I went right into the workforce. There was a reason I went right into the workforce at a young age, 18 years old. And the main reason was because I had my first child at that age. Her name is Shindora, love you. And that was the reason why the first thing that came into my mind was you have to take care of your family. And anyone watching this video, it's the only message I can leave you. Always take care of your family. So I decided to go ahead and get some jobs, or any job that I could, to pay the bills. And one of the jobs I got was, burglar alarm systems, surveillance systems, cash register repair. None of that really, made me feel like I was worthy of what I was doing. And then I ended up at a company called Marbalite. And Marbalite was a company that built traffic control systems. And from those systems, I was a test engineer, and I tested solid-state controllers as well as mechanical controllers, and I was one of the best test engineers they had. And I'm not saying that to brag, I just know that to be a fact. In fact, when microprocessor technology was introduced, they had to choose one of the test engineers, or 2 of the test engineers, to get trained on those microprocessors so that they could go ahead and test out those controllers. And they chose me as one of those 2 engineers. So I ended up going to Fairchild's facilities and taking classes, learning how to develop solutions around their microprocessor. And that really was the launching pad for what happened for the rest of my career. So at Marbalite, while testing these microprocessor controlled technologies, I realized that, there's more in life for me than testing boxes. And I wanted to experience more than just that. So I started putting my resume out on the street, and a company called APF Electronics called me up. They were based in Midtown Manhattan, which I loved. Anyone young growing up in New York City has a dream of working in Midtown Manhattan. If it couldn't be on Wall Street, at least you were in Midtown. So I did that. I went to APF. I interviewed with Ken Boylan, who was the chief engineer at the time, and we really just hit it off. So he hired me, and he probably took some backlash, at least up front, in hiring me as an African American engineer to develop on his technologies. But he did, and I proved to him that he made the right choice. So we worked together. We worked long hours to meet deadlines so that we can put out the MP-1000 as well as eventually the Imagination Machine. Now, let me go back to my history for a second. I don't want to leave that. You know, when you're growing up in a place like Brownsville, Brooklyn, you struggle every day to figure out whether or not you can make it out of that environment. That is not an easy thing to do. I grew up with, I'm going to say, over a dozen friends. And out of the dozen friends that I grew up with, and I'm not counting my brothers, I have 4 brothers, but out of the dozen friends that I grew up with, they are either all dead, on drugs, or in jail. Let me say that again. I grew up with a dozen or so friends, and today, if I look back, at least most of them, I would say 11 of the 12 are either in jail, on drugs, or dead. I got married at the age of 21. 2 of my friends out of that dozen were really close to me, so I couldn't choose between the 2 of them to be my best man. So I chose them both. One was a guy named Richard Williamson. The other guy's name was Steve Allen. And I tell this story for a quick piece of knowledge as to what really happened in Brownsville at that time. Steve Allen was a great guy growing up. We had a great relationship. He met his wife around the same time I met my wife. He got married a year before I did, almost on the same day. I was his best man. He was my best man. Over time, their relationship deteriorated, and he became obsessed with proving himself as being one of the street guys in the neighborhood. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, he flipped. And a lot of guys I saw like that flip. And he became a drug dealer and a pimp. And this was a guy I grew up with. I mean, I knew this guy for like 10, 15 years before he flipped on me. And I'm like, how can this happen? You know, so it was amazing to see that transformation of somebody that you grew up with so closely and how they became this other person from out of nowhere. And I'm going to end the story with just this quick piece. Steve Allen wanted to prove to the people in the neighborhood that he was the kingpin for drug dealing. And he rolled up into this apartment, second floor apartment, and shot up about 5 guys, jumped out the window, ran away, but got caught. And he ended up doing 5 consecutive life terms in prison. Steve is no longer with us today. He died 7 years ago in 2011. But that's just one story of many that shows you the things that I had to deal with growing up in that city. So here I am today telling you this story because it's important for folks to understand that it doesn't matter where you're from. What matters is where you can get to. And I knew there was a place that I needed to get to. So I did everything in my power to get to that place. And I was fortunate enough to have the mindset to learn. And what I did learn was technical electronics. So let me go back, bring you back up front, back forward. So here we are with the MP-1000. And from there, we decided, okay, we see that companies like Atari and others were at least announcing that they were going to take their video game and make a console unit that you can plug into it to turn it into a personal computer. So we thought we would get the jump on these guys and do it first. This is where the overnight work really came in at. We spent long hours working very hard to build our console unit and get it to market before our competition. So in a period of, I would say, 8 to 9 months, working really hard, really long, we came out with our console and introduced it to the marketplace. So I was one of the engineers. that went out with the sales reps to help promote and talk about this new computer called the Imagination Machine. And I won't lie to you, there was not much innovation in developing the Imagination Machine. What we really did, we reverse engineered the Apple I, the TRS-80, Trash 80, if you remember that, and the Commodore PET, those three computers. So we just took their designs and came up with our own and put that in the market. It was that simple. It was pretty easy to get computer designs at that time from almost anywhere. I mean, I think I read an Omni magazine article that had a computer design in it, so it wasn't as if we were stealing a lot. But just so you know, we were not that innovative either. So anyway, here is this Imagination Machine. So we wanted to distribute it to our normal channel of distribution, and at that time it was Sears and Montgomery Ward. And I had sales reps who said, okay, Ed, I can talk about a video game, but I cannot talk about a computer. I don't know anything about RAM or ROM or anything that these folks want to hear about. I need you to go with me to pitch the Imagination Machine. And I did. And I was very good at it. So I talked up the technology. Folks loved it. I went back to work. The salesperson pats me on the back, telling me what a great job I did, and then telling me how much of a commission he got. And I turned at him and said, "Are you kidding me? I thought I did the pitch." So that was interesting to me. And for a while, I did that anyway. But at one point, I went back into the VP of sales, and I said, there should be some compensation for me for pitching these systems like this. And he said, you're right. He says, I'm going to talk to Ken Boyling and see if we can change your title and make you do some other things besides bench work. And sure enough, overnight, I became a technical specialist at APF and ended up going out on the road promoting the Imagination Machine. You can see my picture. I have a picture with me showing the machine at the Consumer Electronics Show, CES in Las Vegas. I think that was one of the first shows that I did. I went to a number of different computer chains to pitch to them. So all of a sudden, almost overnight, I became this other person, this person that I never expected to be, because all I really wanted to be was that guy who was sitting at the bench doing engineering work. Now here I am pitching the Imagination Machine. And as one of my favorite ball players of all time, Yogi Berra, once said, when you get to a fork in the road, take it. And that's what I did. So I didn't hesitate to change career paths as I saw the way things were changing. Now, here's one of the problems we had with APF. When we built the Imagination Machine, it had a tape drive built into it. And unfortunately, the market was already moving to floppy disk drives. So we did not time the market appropriately. And unfortunately, the Imagination Machine did not sell as well as our competitors. And at the end of the day, the winner was Apple. In fact, if anybody recalls this history, there was a lot of the Commodore PETs weren't selling, the Trash 80s weren't selling. Everybody was buying the Apple I and eventually the Apple II personal computer. So we weren't the only technology company at that time that had problems. So anyway, our problems ended up being money problems, and APF was starting to go out of business, and clearly it was time for me to move on. So I did, but that was the start of my career in this area of technology. That technical specialist role was something that was very important at that time, and I didn't even know it, because after doing that work, I was able to get a job at Apple doing pretty much the same thing for their computer systems, pitching it to their dealers all through the upstate New York territory. I would be with Apple today, but unfortunately they had their own problems at that time. And I can tell you two problems that most of you who have the history of Apple will recall. The first problem was the Apple III, and the second was the Apple Lisa. Both of those systems came out one after the other, and they both failed miserably, and so did Apple's stock. So they started to exit people from the company, and I was one of the people that got exited. And I decided, okay, I'm going to leave Albany and take my talents elsewhere. And I ended up in New Jersey working for a company called Novell, which was the leader in networking technology at the time. They hired me to manage the Mid-Atlantic territory. So I just went from a technical specialist working for Apple to a sales manager managing, what do I have, 5 sales reps and 2 technical people that I was responsible for managing those folks as well as the dealers in the Mid-Atlantic territory for Novell. And I was mentored by the president of Novell at that time, Ray Norda, one of the best individuals I had ever met up until I met the current president of my current company, who was Aaron Aiden. They're both very similar. And my current company, by the way, is a company called Kronos, and they are the leader in human capital management software, if you haven't heard of them. So from Apple to Novell, 13 years with Novell. Great ride. Had a lot of great friends, a lot of great relationships there, and those relationships were also alliance relationships. And I did a lot of alliance business development activity in my career, working with some of the top companies in the industry for ensuring our products were integrated so that clients can get the advantage of world-class technologies from those companies. So that's where my career ended up at. I spent some time doing consulting at a company called Infosys, a multi-billion-dollar Indian-based IT outsourcing company. Just imagine this guy from Brownsville, Brooklyn now, traveling to India, right? Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi. I'm all over the place, right? I'm on this plane, taking this long plane ride. And the only thing in my mind is, how did a kid from Brooklyn get here, right? How does this happen? So it goes through your head, and you're like, wow, this is an amazing trip, right? An amazing legacy that I look back on, and I think, something had to start this, and I really wish I could put my finger on exactly what that was, but I can't. The only thing I can think of is the determination I had to take care of my family. And that was where I started, and I think that's where I will end it at as well. I want to remind you that I also had another daughter 2 years after my first daughter was born. Her name is Letitia. Love you too. And I also want to make sure that I thank some folks who really got me to put this video together after almost 40 years. I mean, 40 years goes by, and it's like nobody even thought about what I did back then. But all of a sudden, a lot of folks, researchers, have been looking back at the video game industry and came up with me and saw that I was one of the first African Americans to develop a video game. And I say one of the first. And I want to make that clear because there was another who's probably a lot smarter than me, by the way. And his name was Charles Lawson out of California. And he was also highly responsible as an African American for the work that he did to develop video game technology as well. So I do want to thank Benj Edwards, who was the first person at Vintage Computers who looked me up through his research and connected with me and put out an excellent article about the story that I just told you. And you can find that story on Vintage Computing. All you have to do is look up Ed Smith APF, and you will see the entire story there. So Benj, thank you again. I also want to thank Dr.StefanPiasecki, and I'm hoping I pronounced your name right, Doctor. He is a professor out of Germany, a research professor researching the video game industry, who also connected with me. And he was the guy who was able to find this MP-1000 from out of like nowhere for me to take a look at and play around with and give me some historical knowledge that I lost over 40 years. I'm like, this is amazing to see this game again and to be able to touch it and feel it and look on the inside and see the work that I did. And I'm thinking, wow, that was pretty good. I guess I was a smart guy at that time. So thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Professor, for getting me connected again with the MP-1000. And thanks to everyone who did anything to further my career and to help me to get to where I am today. That includes my wife, Sheila, who I am still with today after 46 years together. What a ride. Love you, babe. So thanks again. I hope everyone sees this video and can take something from it. And the big lesson is Never give up, and there's always going to have to be something that motivates you. And for me, it was family. For you, it might be something else, but find what that is. And one last thing to remember, that fork in the road, take it. Thanks again.